Quer desenvolver os talentos da sua equipe e potencializar os resultados da sua empresa? Conte com a expertise do atendimento corporativo do Senac São Paulo, que já capacitou mais de 1 milhão de pessoas e profissionais de instituições públicas, privadas e terceiro setor. Construa uma equipe altamente motivada e capacitada e destaque-se no mercado. Entre em contato, acesse sp.senac.br/corporativo e saiba mais. Quer saber? Senac.
Today on CityCast Madison. It's Thursday, so of course, we're dishing on Madison's food scene. Many of us are enjoying the full extent of our fresh summer produce coming from our local markets and our own gardens. And do you smell that? Those whiffs of fall rolling in? Yup, some leaves are starting to drop. And with that, it's a perfect time to consider preserving your fresh summer fruits and veggies to enjoy them across the colder months we know are coming. There are many ways to preserve your bounty. 3 big ones: canning, fermenting, and freezing. So we sat down with local farmer, forager, and certified nutrition coach, Crystal Ann Hanson, to get her time-tested methods on preserving your foods. It's Thursday, August 22nd. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Crystal Ann, hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. So you are truly a woman of many talents and titles: yoga instructor, certified fitness and nutrition coach. You've taught cooking classes for the past 14 years. What sparked your interest in preserving nourishing eats year long through your own farming and foraging and using methods like canning and fermentation?
Ooh, many things. Probably goes back to my roots and my upbringing. I grew up on a farm, and we basically raised all of our own food. Our garden was a field. We all helped preserve it. And it just seemed like that was the way of life. Then I went to college and didn't do much preserving then. As soon as I got my own place and graduated, I started again for myself, just being motivated to preserve those fresh vegetables and fruits when they were in season. So started up canning, growing my own food again, freezing, fermenting. It just seemed like a way of life for me, and it just seemed natural and healthy.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And we've got so many farms. We are in a beautiful state full of farmland. But you don't have to be a farmer to preserve your produce, right?
Oh, absolutely not. We have so many options, and you can actually grow your own food in very small spaces and pot gardens, on rooftops, in the soil, if you have the space. But we also have access to food co-ops and farmers markets, farm stands, all those places where you can access really good, healthy food.
Is this the time of year that's primed to start thinking about stowing away veggies and fruit to enjoy over the colder months? Is there a seasonality to this?
There certainly is. It's important to harvest the food when they're at their prime. So I started picking service berries early in the spring. Those berries come in first, then the blackcap raspberries. Then we move into blackberry season, elderberry season, aronia berries. You have to kind of be on alert and be in tune to nature. If you're growing your own food or going to a farmer's market, you can see what's there. As soon as those, vegetables are ready to be picked, that's the time to ferment them and preserve them. Right when they're at their peak is the best time. So yes, 'tis the season.
'Tis the season. And I've never heard of aronia berries. They sound fun.
Ooh, they are so fun. They used to be called chokeberries.
That sounds less fun.
That does sound so fun. I think they're named that way because they tend to be quite astringent and almost a little bitter and sour. That doesn't make them sound appealing, but maybe this will make them sound appealing. They are considered the food that has the highest antioxidant value of any other food. And they're in season right now. And so I was fortunate enough to have a friend who invited me out to her farm, and I picked and picked and picked. And I made aronia berry jam. I made aronia berry syrup, not a syrup for ice cream, but like a cough syrup, a kind of healthy preventative syrup. And then I froze so many of the fresh berries so I can have them over the winter to bake them into muffins and, breads and cakes and crisps and things like that.
And getting those antioxidants. I love it. So let's talk about some of these methods. What's the difference between canning and fermenting for preservation? Can you walk us through your process for each of those? Like, what are the key steps?
Whoa, they're very, very different.
Yeah, that's why I was like, we better distinguish this early.
Canning is a process that the way that I'm familiar with is you either use a hot water bath canner or you use a pressure cooker. And the vegetables, I'll talk mainly about vegetables. That's typically what's canned. There's a process. It's really important to balance the pH and the acid when you do canning. So some things aren't as good for canning as others. And following like a well-known established recipe to make sure you get that right balance of salt and acid, which could be lemon juice or vinegar or something else. And again, getting the food at its prime. So, if you can pick your tomatoes that day and go home and go through the canning process, they'll be at their peak and they'll be their best. Okay, let's just talk about tomatoes. Canning tomatoes.
Perfect.
It's a lot of work. Honestly, it's a lot of work. So what I do is take the whole tomatoes and you make a little X on the top of the tomato. You dip it in some very hot water and then immediately dip it into ice water. Take it out of the ice water, and where you've made the X will help loosen the peelings, and you peel it. And you put it into another container until you get all these tomatoes. You can leave them whole or you can cut them. Then you pack them into sterilized, really clean canning jars. The rings and the flats lids have to also be sterilized and really hot. Everything needs to be hot. And your hot water canner is boiling away at a full boil on the stove. So then you fill up the rest of your jar using your recipe with, there's some salt and some acid, maybe just enough tomato juice, maybe some water. Put the flats on, clean the lid of the jar.
Because otherwise they'll be compromised, right? That's why you keep emphasizing the sterilization process.
Everything needs to be sterilized because there's so many good and bad bacteria in the air, on the produce, all around us. So we want to make sure we seal out the bad and hold in the good stuff. And so then you process, called hot water bath processing. You put the jars in the canner for as long as the recipe says, they boil away, and then you take them out and let them rest. The best thing about canning for me, besides having the produce out of season, is the lids will pop when they're ready. So you hear all this like little popping. And to me, it's like, yes, they're popping. If they don't pop, it means they're not sealing, and you have to not use those. You can reprocess them with new lids, or you can use that product right away. So canning's a lot of work. And guess when tomatoes are in season? Usually when it's late August, early September, it's really hot outside. And then you're doing this process in your home that's also really hot because all these things are boiling away. But it can be done. A really easy way that I have found to preserve tomatoes, pick the tomatoes or get them from your farmer, wash them, make sure they're completely dry, put them into gallon size freezer bags whole, seal the bags, put them in, they're ready to go. And then when you take them out to use them in your food over the winter, if you just run a little hot water over them, the peelings come off, you have these tomatoes. So it seems like a lot less effort, and it is, but it depends on what you want to do, how you're going to use them, maybe the space that you have. Some people have a really small freezer space, but maybe there is more space in your home to store jars. So tomatoes are just one example. I use that because a lot of people can tomatoes or preserve tomatoes. It's a big deal.
And that's perfect. I'm so glad you did. And honestly, I am living for this conversation because, I've seen, canners over time, and I'm at I don't know if I want to say the age, but I'm kind of like, I want to be doing this. And it's giving me the empowerment to actually try and do it. So we really appreciate that.
You just have to do it. Or you can, have someone that come over and give you a little guidance.
Você que está ouvindo o seu podcast, sabia que tudo que o Google faz tem a intenção de trazer impacto positivo? Como? O Jefferson da Tributei usou inteligência artificial para facilitar o dia a dia das empresas. Ele e milhares de empreendedores geraram mais de 188 bilhões com as plataformas do Google. E a Miriane se formou em UX com certificados profissionais do Google, criando o seu próprio negócio. Ela e 88% dos formados relataram avanços profissionais como promoção ou novo emprego. Tem que ser bom para todo mundo. Google.
Enquanto você curte um som, a ClearSale cuida da segurança antifraude de mais de 100 mil empresas em todo o mundo. Só falta a sua. Fale com os nossos especialistas e fique um passo à frente das fraudes e riscos de crédito. Encontre soluções flexíveis que se adaptam às necessidades da sua empresa e garanta múltiplas camadas de proteção em cada transação. ClearSale, one step ahead.
I've heard that you love fermentation. So what's that about?
I do love fermentation because, there's so many reasons. First of all, for fermentation, we're holding in most all of the vitamins. And sometimes I've actually read that there's more vitamin C created during the process because it's this living organism. When we can, we're sealing in, everything stopped growing, etc. But fermentation is alive. And we're working with the healthy microorganisms that are on the fruits or vegetables. And to me, that's such a fascinating process to be able to grow this food in my garden, pick it, do a little bit of processing with it, like cutting it up, maybe making a salt brine, putting it in clean, sterilized jars, and letting it bubble away for, depending on what you're making, a few days, or sometimes sauerkraut will take several weeks. And then you get this wonderful living food that's full of nutrition, probiotics. It tastes good. Fermentation also breaks down the food, so the food is easier to digest. Just so many benefits. And I love kind of the sour taste of it. And your finished products can be used in so many ways. I've used fermented vegetables to roll up into homemade sushi. They can be a side salad. You can add them to other foods, sandwiches, just eat them on their own. It's so versatile. And you can add so many different herbs, garlic, and different things to make them have a different kind of taste. And there are some variables, and it's not an exact science. Like canning is more of an exact science. With fermentation, we do have some controls, some things that are really important to keep in mind. Always have to use very clean water. And when I say clean water, it can't have chemicals. So it should be free of fluoride and chlorine because those things will interfere with the healthy bacteria. They're in our drinking water to kill the unhealthy bacteria, right? And so we need to take those out of the water. And then salt is a preservative. We also have to be aware of the kind of salt we use. It can't be just regular table salt because that has additives in it, anti-clumping additives and other things. So getting like a kosher canning salt or a pure sea salt is your best way. And then getting your vegetables when they're nice and fresh. That's when they're going to have the most active microbes on them. If I'm using carrots or radishes or other types of food that have peelings, I'll leave the peelings on because the microbes are embedded in that. You want to get as many of those healthy microbes as possible. Clean equipment, again, everything has to be sterilized and clean, and that's pretty much all you need to do.
I think that's one of the things that folks are really, they hear about the fermentation process and they're like, how do I stay safe and ensure the quality of the food in the process? So it sounds like you're kind of getting at some of those beats.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's important that everything's just really clean. And then my rule is if it's under the brine, all will be fine. And so, and it's true.
If it's under the brine, all will be fine.
So it's like a little fermentation mantra. Because it's an anaerobic process, meaning we do not want oxygen to get involved once it's started. So we have everything under a brine, which is either a salt brine that you've created with a certain ratio of this good water and, healthy non-clumping salt, or a self-brining method where you've squeezed or pounded out the natural juices of the food, like if you're making sauerkraut with cabbage, and then it's a self-brine. So you get enough brine that covers the vegetables, and then there's some little secrets you can use: an oak leaf, wild grape leaves, or part of cabbage leaves to put over top of your jar or your crock, whatever you're fermenting in. And that helps push down the vegetables to stay in the brine. And then you can add a little weight. It can be as simple as a bag of your brine on top.
To keep everything at bay. Stay under the brine.
Everything under the brine, all will be fine. And then I like to call it, I put it into the witness protection program. It's just my fun way of it now goes into a dark place with a temperature ranging between 70 to 80 degrees. And those are some of the variables that you may not have total control over, like exactly what temperature it is, but you try to stay in that temperature range. Too cool, and it might ferment, but it might take a long time, and that could prevent spoilage. If it's too hot, the same thing, it might ferment too quickly and not be good. So you want to have this middle ground. The other thing we can't really control is how many of those healthy microbes are on the vegetable. So to ensure that you're getting the best is, again, to buy them freshly picked right out of the earth if possible, and then work with them as soon as possible.
That's something I feel like I learned a lot about in college. This sounds like a horrible story. But just the microbial life on our plants, and just hearing you bring that up, that is part of that whole process. And I also want to know, when I was reading about fermentation, I had read something about if you're in an overly hot apartment, so maybe earlier in the summer, maybe consider waiting until a little bit later so you don't mess up this process, and just during summer, enjoy your produce and then ferment the last harvest. Does that sound
that's
right?
An excellent idea. The temperature is really important to find some regulation there.
Yeah.
And I did this one experimental ferment. Well, I've done many experimental ferments, but I had read in this book about an end of the garden ferment, which I thought was so interesting. And this person was recommending just taking whatever is left on your vine, little baby eggplants, little tiny squash, carrots. Often carrots aren't harvested till more after the first frost. Green tomatoes, whatever you have, putting it in your vessel, maybe adding some fresh herbs, making your salt brine, and doing the same process. And I'm like, wow, what is this going to be? It looked really cool. I had this big gallon jar so I could see these layers and colors. And it fermented really well. And it was just so interesting to taste something different and different textures. Because often when you ferment, the vegetables stay crisp. And that's one of the reasons to use the oak leaf or the wild grape leaf. They have tannins in them, and those help to keep the vegetables crisp. So there are many different things you can experiment with, and it's really fun.
Tips and tricks. So you mentioned some. So what are your go-to fermentation projects for beginners who want to start experimenting at home?
Ooh, good question. I just taught a fermentation class last week. I teach at least one a year. And I will add that I have my special fermentation t-shirt that says, "Make kimchi, not war."
That's the first thing I ever fermented. When I lived in DC, I somehow landed in the most Madison group house with 6 people. And they're like, what are we going to do? We're going to make kimchi. And we ate on it for months.
Yes. So the go-tos for beginners are I teach a salt brine method where we're making our own brine. And with that, we could make, I call them veggie snacks. So you might choose carrots, radishes, hunks of cabbage, pickles, or, cucumbers, which will then turn into pickles. Those are really easy things to do. You just have your clean jars, put them in the jar, make your brine, and you might add fresh dill, garlic, hot peppers, and they'll ferment within 3 to 5 days, depending on your vegetables and the temperature. So right away, a beginner has these delicious snacks to eat. I also introduce a self-brining method, which sauerkraut is a self-brining method. So you extract the natural brine or the juices from the sauerkraut, and that's the brine that covers it. That takes a little longer, but then you have something to look forward to.
Yeah. We love sauerkraut and with our brats, but a lot of people don't eat brats, but you can have vegan brats. So it's all good.
I think sauerkraut's good with anything. And then
fair.
I like to introduce beginners also into a different method of fermentation, not using vegetables, but making ginger beer, non-alcoholic ginger beer. And that's really fun because you use fresh ginger root. Ginger has a specific yeast as its microbial beneficial organ that we use. And you make something called a ginger bug. Doesn't sound appealing, but nothing like a real bug. And that's just a simple mixture of, again, this clean water, some grated fresh ginger root, and a little bit of sugar. And you keep it in a warm place like we do our other ferments. And every day you feed it. So you give it the same amount of sugar and grated ginger. And typically within, again, depending, on the variables, within 3 to 5 days, it will be bubbling. And it's really awesome. You can see the bubbles. I've actually heard it. So then your ginger bug is ready. It's fully fermented. And then you go to the second process of my ginger brew recipe makes a gallon of ginger beer. So you boil water and you add a little bit of sugar because it needs that to feed on. It's the food. There's lemon juice. There's tons of fresh grated ginger. Sometimes I'll throw a couple berries in there just for some added juice. And then you bottle it. And that ferments for 2 weeks. And so unlike many store-bought ginger brews, when you take this out of the fridge, it's not super sweet and sugary, but it's well fermented. So you have the natural fermentation in the bubbles instead of adding carbon dioxide like unfermented ginger brews would be. And so that's a fun project to make too. So letting new fermenters kind of explore some of these methods. And once you learn those methods, especially with the self-brine and salt brine, you can ferment almost any vegetable.
Yes. Well, I feel like Madison has such an abundance of local farmers markets where folks can pick up fresh and seasonal ingredients. What are some of your favorite seasonal ingredients to work with right now?
Whatever's in season. So right now, I specifically grow things in my garden for things I know I'm going to ferment or I know I'm going to can. So right now I have 2 cabbages left. I've already done a huge batch of kimchi using my radishes, cabbage, and carrots, and I've made sauerkraut, and I have 2 left, so I can make more batches of that. I'm growing Brussels sprouts, which I'll make pickled Brussels sprouts that I'll be canning. You could also ferment them. And so that's another easy way. Another way is to do a quick pickle. I'll throw that in there, where you don't have to can it. You can quick pickle vegetables, and that will keep in the fridge for, several months as well. Other things right now, my hot peppers and chili peppers, and my cauliflower is still growing. I like to make this hot, spicy vegetable mix with all of that. That'll be pickled.
Well, Crystal Ann, I want to just move in with you because you sound like you have a good time. This has been such a service.
You're welcome to move in, but with all the fermentation and things right now, there's not a lot of room.
Not a lot of room, and it's very funky.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you so much. Thank you for giving us your time and insights about how you go about canning and fermenting. This has been really, really wonderful.
It's been great to be here. I really appreciate it.
That's Crystal Ann Hanson, certified fitness nutrition coach and more out of Fitchburg. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with the biggest forward planner in your life? Hey, they might already be on this. All right, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, be well.